Wow, being unhoused and sleeping or camping on public property in Florida is now illegal. One of the strictest anti-unhoused measures in the nation came into effect on October 1st.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the bill in March and said, quote, "The state will not allow homeless encampments to intrude on its citizens or undermine their quality of life." Republican State Senator Jonathan Martin said in a statement, "It's our responsibility to deal with homelessness, and that's why we can't wait any longer."
Starting January 1st, residents, business owners, and the state can sue municipalities for not doing enough to help the unhoused get off the streets. Florida estimates to have 31,000 unhoused people, and a state budget of $30 million has been allocated to help municipalities enacting the law. However, there are insufficient resources to develop solutions to avoid being sued. So what does this new law mean? Will the unhoused be arrested solely for sleeping in public places? Now, Amber, this used to not be the law of the land. Sure, private properties are off limits, and that has been the case across the board. There are certain municipalities and states that do not have this law and have pushed back, but there was a Supreme Court decision in late June that made it so that municipalities and lawmakers locally could fight back and target the unhoused. But, you know, again, like, Is there an issue with unhoused people in this country? Is it increasing? Yes. Do we not have enough housing for folks? Yes. Majority of those who are unhoused are actually working people, and most of them are actually women with children. So we have a crisis, and our government is not providing the solutions to rising housing costs. And are there other factors at play? Like, are there people who have mental health issues that do not have the support? It's not always the case that they'll get the support when it's offered, but still, we need to provide more support. And just persecuting them, just to me, seems inhumane and not the answer.
So I agree with the idea that we should be providing drug rehabilitation as well as mental health services and shelter to people who need it. What I don't necessarily agree with is the idea that letting people stay in encampments on the street is the compassionate answer to this. When you see these encampments and the things that go on there, it is horrific.
I agree.
There are women who are raped. There are people who are beaten and abused. They are held hostage by some of the more mentally unwell individuals who are in the encampments, and that can't be the solution. And in addition to the people within the encampments who are not doing well, you also have the people who live in that community who sometimes have to interact with people who are frankly crazy. And I mean, it used to be the case here in DC where walking through Union Station was like an exercise in trying to avoid street harassment and not get randomly hit by a homeless guy. I mean, that's unacceptable for any public place, for someone to not feel safe in a building that is funded by their taxpayer dollars. Recently, what Washington, D.C. did last year is they actually finally empowered the National Park Service through the federal government to clear out encampments that were on public land, because in DC, most of the public land is actually owned by the federal government as opposed to the city of DC. And they cleared out Columbus Circle, McPherson Square, some of the other public parks that are around the city. And yes, some people moved to other public places that are not under the jurisdiction of National Park Service. A lot of them got into shelters, which is a good thing. And the problem with removing an element of consequence for people for not going into a shelter and staying in a public place is that, as you alluded to, a lot of them don't have the wherewithal to accept help because they don't want to go to a shelter because shelters don't allow drugs, for example. Or they make you give up some of your items that a lot of times is just trash or dirty clothes. And I don't think the answer to that is to say, well, since they didn't want to go into the shelter, then we just let them go back out on the street. Sometimes the right answer for people who are not able to say yes to help is to compel them to do it.
I hear you on that, and there is a minority group of folks that really do need help and are refusing the help and are definitely the more visible in the community in which people don't feel safe, right? But when it comes to shelters, and I'm speaking really for New York and Los Angeles in particular, they're really unsafe. There have been so many stories at this point that have come out about how mothers don't feel safe with their kids. And we have a shelter issue too. I'm a big fan of the housing first policy that are starting to spread, thank goodness, in different municipalities around the country. It's definitely been debated in New York. New York has a bunch of other issues too, just affordability issues. One more factor just in terms of housing and mental health, let's just put that in a jar for a second because there are mentally challenged people who are having issues with mental health that are unhoused. Put that aside. But people who just are working folks, have kids, can't afford housing in cities where most of the jobs are in this country, there's an affordability crisis. And I'm very passionate in at least New York City about taking on the real estate developers who are profiting off of these like YIMBY campaigns where they're saying build more housing, build more housing, build more housing, and we'll add some affordability into that housing. And it's not really affordable, but when you're building that much housing, it's increasing the cost of housing. But meanwhile, in New York City and Los Angeles and Miami, I assume also in Washington, D.C., you have quite a few warehouses, like it's called warehousing, where landlords will play this game where they will push out the residents so that they can increase the rents, hold them so it increases more, and the market rate goes up. And it's this landlord scheme and developer scheme that happens around cities around the country in which you have a lot of empty housing available, not to mention the folks who are, foreign folks who are laundering money through apartments in these big cities, which is actually a big number. Yeah. So the market rate is going up because you have these industries that are completely unregulated and politicians in these cities who are beholden to them, and these schemes to basically wash them away from, it's like housing washing, they call it. Oh, just build, build, build. Well, who makes money when you build, build, build is the developers, is the landlords. And it's not actually reducing the cost of housing in these cities, and it's not a solution. And most economists who focus on housing agree with this. It's the ones that don't are usually on the payroll of the organizations that are funded by the developers. So we have a huge issue in this country, and I actually don't agree with Kamala Harris's housing position. I think it's important that she's talking about it, but I think it's too much in favor of the developers. And there's going to come a point where it's just not going to work out anymore because we're going to continue to have unhoused folks on the streets, and we do not have the resources to take care of them right now.
I guess my contention is that increasing the supply of housing should decrease the cost. So where is it that you're getting that the cost is increasing? Because they're leaving lots vacant?
So they have, there's at least I think 200,000 or something like that warehouse apartments in New York City right now. That means that when they're keeping the supply down, so the more you're building, you'd think, right? Supply and demand. It doesn't work that way in New York. They're warehousing the apartments in New York and Los Angeles and DC, wherever, and they're also, there's laundering situations, legal laundering situations, where foreign oligarchs, New York Times did an amazing story on this a few years ago.
Yeah, I know China's really involved in that.
Very much so. And we don't talk about this enough because it's actually a national security issue too.
Very true.
It was on the cover of the New York Times a few years ago where they showed a bunch of apartments in New York City in the skyline, and they were all dark. And they had pinpointed the majority of the apartments in those buildings were foreign folks, oligarchs in particular, who were buying up the properties because it's safe for them to put their money in cash. And you can buy real estate in cash in America. And Michael Bloomberg was a big proponent of this, shocker. But that drives up the cost of real estate.
Sure.
The people who are renting or purchasing these apartments are not working people. And even the affordable apartments are still going for $3,000, $4,000 a month. That's wild. What kind of working person can afford a $4,000 apartment? You have to be upper middle class. In New York, you have to make $175,000. They said, this just came out 2 days ago, to have a 2-bedroom apartment in New York City. That's the base.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I want to ban foreign ownership of private property in the United States entirely. I mean, with some exceptions, I suppose. But yeah, I'm very, very big on that, especially the Chinese influence of them buying up farmland and apartment buildings.
Farmland is wild. And those stories that come out.
And I'm also very critical of private equity's involvement in buying single-family homes and taking up housing supply that way. But there is a trade-off as well, because in DC recently they found that the landlords who were providing the affordable housing are on the verge of bankruptcy because of the emergency rental assistance program that they passed during COVID, because they stopped collecting rent.
Right.
And they can't afford to keep these buildings anymore. And so all of these people who are living for free right now are going to be evicted because the building's going to have to be torn down or sold to another developer or land or private equity. BlackRock's going to come in and buy it. So yeah, it's not a simple solution. I mean, I don't want to hit you with like a drive-by comment as we're about to leave the segment, but we do also have millions of migrants who are going into these cities who
They're going into empty hotels. That's what's happening in New York City.
Well, in a combination of apartment complexes like we saw in Aurora, Colorado, and New York has a mandatory housing policy for migrants.
But they're going into empty hotels. It's not happening in housing. If it was, that would be, well, there is no housing for them to go into. I have an idea. Why don't they open up those warehouse house apartments?
Well, and maybe the empty hotels could have been used as shelters for some of the homeless American citizens.
It's been extremely controversial, and Billionaires Row, all the billionaires, of course, complained because they were popping up.
Okay. All right.
Big issue.
Yes, a lot of moving parts. We're going to have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this break.